Dear listeners of The Laundry, welcome back to another episode, and I'm super excited to have today's guest, Oliver Bullough, as on the show. He's an award-winning journalist, and his work appears frequently in The Guardian, The New York Times, and GQ. He's also written some very exciting books on the topic of financial crime. He's written Moneyland, Why Thieves and Crooks Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back, and also his latest book, Butler to the World, How Britain Became the Servant of Tycoons, Tax Dodgers, Kleptocrats, and Criminals, which I have here. So welcome, Oliver.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
This latest book, Butler to the World, is scaringly well timed with the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions imposed by the West and, the more current effort now to try to freeze the efforts of the oligarchs. So good timing on that.
Yeah, it was strange, really, because last autumn, so autumn 2021, when we were discussing publicity at the publishing company, we were trying to work out, how do we make financial crime and Britain's enabling of financial crime kind of cut through in a mainstream way. And we were chucking ideas around, and we had some thoughts, but none of them were really amounting to all that much. And I suppose, we were just hoping that maybe people who'd bought Moneyland would buy it and people would be interested. And then suddenly the Ukraine crisis happened, and everyone wanted to know about oligarchs. Everyone wanted to know about financial crime. And it's been a pretty busy year ever since, to be honest, which, is obviously awful because it's terrible that it took such a colossal tragedy to finally make people take seriously the issue of kleptocracy and financial crime. But I suppose at least people are now discussing it, and hopefully that means that these kind of crises and tragedies might not be quite so serious in future. I mean, possibly.
Yeah, and I didn't know that much about it, to be honest, even though I work in the compliance space, not to this detail. And I listened to this book on audio version during Christmas, and I found myself doing longer and longer cross-country skiing trips just to I need to listen to one more chapter before I get home. I really can recommend it to everyone, and it's shocking and depressing and also brilliantly written. So I'm very excited to take our listeners into a deep dive of this today. But how did you become interested in the financial crime space, and what inspired you to write these books?
Yeah, so I'm not an economist or a compliance guy. I studied history at university. I was always passionately interested, above all, in Eastern Europe. When I was a student, it was the late 1990s, and there had been this whole period during my teenage years when communism had ended, and there'd been the war in Yugoslavia, and then, endless turbulence in Eastern Europe. And it really felt like that's where history was happening. And I found it fascinating and wanted to witness it and see it all. So when I left university, I moved to Russia. I moved to St. Petersburg in 1999. And I had this kind of idea that I would be witnessing the development of democracy and prosperity and freedom and everything, and seeing Russia and Ukraine and the other former Soviet republics being welcomed into the kind of European family. That was my extremely naive vision of what I was going to be doing. Obviously, that didn't happen. About 2 or 3 weeks before I arrived in St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin became Prime Minister of Russia. He's been in charge in one way or another ever since. And so throughout that period, instead of it being Russia becoming more democratic, it's become less democratic. And I set out really to try and write about why that was happening, what that meant. And I kept coming across corruption. Initially, I kept coming across corruption in a literal sense, in that people kept shaking me down for bribes. I'll be walking down the street or trying to go through an airport or through a port or whatever. But then the more I looked into the sort of decline of democracy, the decline of liberty in various ways, the more I kept coming up against the fact that you had this very small number of oligarchs who had become astonishingly wealthy while everyone else had lost almost everything. And it seemed increasingly that you couldn't explain what had happened to Eastern Europe or in the former Soviet Union without looking at the oligarchs.
Oligarch, it's on the front page of your book. It says the book the oligarchs don't want you to read.
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. It's the thing to understand about oligarchs is that oligarchs are good at some things, right? They're good at stealing stuff and killing people and rigging elections, but they're not good at other things. They're not good at bringing legal cases in Western jurisdictions. They're not good at, initial public offerings of their shares on major stock exchanges. They're not good at, buying property in West London. They need help for all those things. And so who provided the help? And that was what London did.
And that is the title of the book, Butler to the World. So what
Exactly.
do you put in the term, the word butler? What's happened
Well,
here?
I mean, so essentially every scam I wrote about, every major example of financial crime, whether it was, I don't know, the Danske Bank money laundering case or, you name it, it doesn't really matter what it was. There was always a British role, whether it was a British shell company or a British lawyer, a British accountant, a British politician, whatever, British property. There was always a British role. And that I became troubled by that. What was it about Britain that meant that it was always so central to the financial empires of financial criminals? And that was what a story I wanted to tell. But there's no point in depressing people. This is quite a potentially very depressing story. I had an editor, a very good editor I worked with once, who once told me that you shouldn't write spinach journalism. You shouldn't write, in the same way that you say to a kid, eat your spinach. It's good for you. They'll eat it, but they won't like it. You need to try and make your spinach tasty so they eat it anyway. So what I try and do is do spinach journalism, but cook it up in such a way that people eat it without realizing they're eating spinach. And so it's how do you make the story, essentially a depressing and alarming story? How do you make it fun? So I mixed up the story of British enabling financial crime with this idea of Britain as a butler. Britain is this sort of well-mannered, beautifully dressed, but utterly amoral servant who essentially does whatever his employer wants him to do. And essentially the example I chose to illustrate that is just examples taken from the Jeeves and Wooster stories, which are these comic novels written by a British author called P.G. Wodehouse, in which Jeeves, this very intelligent, capable sort of manservant, will essentially do anything to get his boss, his employer, out of trouble. And, it turns out that because there are so many Jeeves stories, if you read them all, which I did, there are all sorts of parallels with financial crime. And so I found that a funny way of telling a serious story. And so Butler to the World, it's an arresting image. And it allows you allowed me to write a serious story, making what I think is a very serious point, but to try and do it in a funny way, which people would read rather than just being depressed.
Yeah, and I did read a lot of reviews as well, where authors where reviewers said it was depressing reading, and I did feel the same way when reading it. But it is very clever with this the Jeeves parallel. You get very fascinated by the story too. But I know you can't go through like everything and all of the details, but just a high level kind of view on how did the UK and Britain become this world-class enabler of financial crime? What are some of the highlights to that story?
Well, it's a super interesting story because obviously this isn't what Britain used to be. Britain used to be an empire and used to be the oligarch. What Putin's currently doing in Ukraine, that's what Britain used to do. If we didn't agree with a country's trade policy, we'd send around some warships and bomb them until they changed their minds. So, how did we change from being the oligarch to the butler? That's the story that I wanted to tell. And, it's a story that's very much tied to the City of London. The City of London was the engine, the heart of the British Empire. I mean, you could make quite a strong argument, actually, that it wasn't a British Empire at all, but the City of London's empire. And when the empire was gone, you still had this very powerful, very potent financial centre, but without anything really to do anymore. So the story where it begins is in the 1950s with financiers in the City of London essentially looking for something to do. They didn't have an empire to finance, so what do you do with your time? And what they did was find ways to profitably evade the restrictions on the movements of money that were imposed at the end of the Second World War by the creation of what became known as the euro-dollar market, which was essentially a way of trading dollars in Europe in such a way that you managed to have no rules and no taxes, and which essentially allowed the owners of capital to break free from the restrictions put in their way at the end of the Second World War in order to try and, keep the world safe for democracy. And in doing so, they invented this wonderful thing called offshore. And offshore is a concept. It's an extremely flexible and profitable concept. And having invented it, they wanted to see how far it would go. And, Britain doesn't just do offshore finance. It does, offshore reputations, offshore education, offshore, almost everything you need is available in London. And so London has become this one-stop shop for oligarchs. It will hide your wealth, it will structure your wealth, it will invest your wealth, it will sell you anything you need, necessary things, unnecessary things, it will educate your children, it will help you evade taxes, it will do almost anything. And even if you're particularly wealthy and particularly generous to British politicians, it will sell you a place in the House of Lords. So there is this amazing concentration of corruption services available in the City of London, or in London more broadly. And that's kind of what I mean by Butler to the world. And that's the story I wanted to tell of how that happened.
There are many reasons highlighted in your book, and you walk through this, but one thing you point out is that you believe that the world would have looked very different if the people who ran the Bank of England were different people in the 80s. What do you mean by that? How do you think the world would have been if it was run differently back then?
I mean, more in the 50s than the 80s, really. I think by the 80s, the damage was done. In the dying days of the Second World War, the leaders of the Allied powers had put a huge amount of thought and work into how they structured the global financial system in order to try and prevent a repeat of the rampant speculation, financial speculation that helped cause the stock market crash of 1929, and then subsequently the Great Depression, and then the rise of fascism and so on. And they had designed a new form of financial system to try and prevent that happening ever again. And it was amazingly successful, actually, the Bretton Woods system. For as long as it lasted, it managed to create a more equal society than probably there's ever been. Well, actually, I think we probably know than there ever has been before or since. But, it was annoying for the owners of wealth to not be able to move their wealth wherever they wanted it. It was annoying because taxes were very high. So there was a huge demand from the owners of wealth for ways around it. And the City of London created its new business model by serving the owners of that wealth. If it hadn't done so, and the reason it was able to do so is because the Bank of England officials waved it through, it wasn't a sort of a democratic decision by democratic politicians, it was functionaries in the Bank of England who allowed this to happen. If they hadn't done so, then there's every possibility that the Bretton Woods system would have persisted. And you would have ended with, essentially, the maintenance of the New Deal structures far more in the United States, the maintenance of much more control on wealth with a more equal societies, far fewer oligarchs, if any oligarchs, far fewer super rich people. The world would have been a more equal place and a more decent place for everyone rather than just for the very wealthy. So, it's possible that maybe some other country would have invented this system. But I think they would have certainly struggled to invent offshore as well as the City of London did, simply because of the legacy of the British Empire. Britain had connections more broadly than any other country pretty much had at the time. And so it was able to create a very powerful form of offshore finance very quickly, which had, a huge impact, which rippled outwards all over the world and is still being felt. So, I'm a firm believer that that system that was created in 1944 at Bretton Woods would have been a good way of running the world. That sort of form of democratic control over wealth would have been a very valuable thing to maintain. But the reason we don't have it anymore is the fault of the Bank of England.
And just to get on to some of the more specific things that the butler has helped kleptocrat and oligarchs do, and that is, of course, property buying around London. And I've seen some YouTube videos. You do a kleptocrat tour showing off properties that have been swept up by these type of people. And you say that over $1 trillion each year is stolen, and much of it needs to be spent, and much of it is spent on real estate. Can you take our listeners through this kleptocrat tour? What do you do in those?
Yeah, I mean, the idea, I wish it had been my idea. It wasn't my idea. It's the idea of my friend Roman Borisovich, who is a Russian-born banker, who came up with the idea. He's a very funny guy. And essentially the idea is the same as a Hollywood bus tour. You can go to Hollywood, get on a bus, and people will point out, that house belongs to, I don't know, Demi Moore. I don't know. I haven't been on one. That house belongs to Bruce Willis. That used to belong to Charlie Chaplin, whatever, I'm guessing, but I imagine that's probably what happens. Essentially, the idea is the same, but instead of showing film stars, we show houses that belong to oligarchs and kleptocrats. So normally the tour starts, there's a very nice house just on the River Thames, just up downstream from Parliament, where the former Russian deputy prime minister has an extremely luxurious apartment. So normally we start there because it's easy to park. And then what we do then, it sort of depends on, which guides we've managed to get on board. It's only run by volunteers. So, who we can get involved sort of slightly depends on who's available. But the good thing about London, or the bad thing about London, depending on how you look at it, is we have kleptocrats from all over the world. So, if we have an expert in Nigeria, we can talk about Nigerians. If we have an expert in Malaysia, we talk about Malaysians. An expert in Kazakhs, we talk about Kazakhstan. But we always have experts in Russia because, that's our crew and there are a lot of Russians around. So, we like to, if the traffic isn't too bad, we like to go to North London to show off this house, Whittenhurst, the second largest house in London after Buckingham Palace. That belongs to a Russian fertilizer magnate. We like to go via Knightsbridge because then we can show a tube station that belongs to Dmitry Firtash, a Ukrainian gas magnate. We like to, whichever ones do we like to see? Eaton Square is lovely. It's kind of ground zero of the kleptocratic wealth concentration in London. Or there's Belgrave Square, just a little bit further south, where Oleg Deripaska's family has a place that was occupied by anarchists around this time last year, just after the invasion of Ukraine. So, London is full of lovely houses, particularly West London and North London. And a lot of those houses belong to oligarchs and kleptocrats. So we could probably keep our tour going every day of the week for weeks and weeks on end and never have to show the same house twice. It's a target-rich environment. But normally people are exhausted after 5 or 6 houses. So that's normally when we stop. You can't keep flogging it forever. But the point is that, it's a silly thing, but there's a serious point, right? Which is that we are trying to show British people that we are part of the kleptocratic system. Kleptocracy isn't just something that happens overseas in poor countries, in the kind of places that score badly on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. That corruption is not something that happens within countries, it's something that happens between countries. And Britain is as much to blame for kleptocracy as Nigeria is, or Malaysia, or Kazakhstan, or Russia. By accepting the money and structuring the theft of the money, we also have a role to play, and that if we want to stop kleptocracy, we need to stop that happening. So that's why we do the kleptocracy tour. It's a bit of silliness, but it has a very serious message.
I was actually walking around Eaton Square after dark a couple of weeks ago to see the area, and it's such a beautiful area. The houses are incredible, but it's just dead. There's no light in any window. You can just go for several blocks, and it's no one there. There's hardly anyone. It's just dead. The most beautiful part of London, or a very beautiful part.
It is. It depends when you're there. There are different times of the year when it becomes quite busy. Obviously, the Russians aren't around at the moment because they've mostly been sanctioned. So that has sort of really depressed, the kind of fun factor from an oligarch's perspective. But one thing that's really interesting, and I don't know if you noticed this, is that quite a lot of the plaques on the houses will have will say, this used to belong to a viceroy of India, or this used to belong to the viceroy of Canada, or whatever. That these kind of houses, the houses that the oligarchs who've looted Nigeria or have looted Russia, they used to belong to British people who looted foreign countries, right? The continuation between the way the British Empire operated and the way kleptocracy operates now is very precise. That the same bits of real estate are inhabited by people now who are essentially the descendants of the British people who used to do the same job. Like I was saying, Britain used to be the oligarch and now it's the butler. What do you do if you know about empire building, but you can't afford to have an empire anymore? You sell your empire building knowledge to other people who want to build empires. So this is what Britain did. It basically, it changed it. It went from the kind of buy side to the sell side, and it changed its knowledge of how to, it monetized its knowledge of how to build an empire by essentially advising oligarchs from other countries of how to be oligarchs, because we in Britain had been very good at doing that for a very long time. And the continuation is incredibly pronounced, right down to the same houses being inhabited by oligarchs as were inhabited by British oligarchs back in the day when we used to have them.
What surprised you the most in writing this book?
The chapter which shocked me most in researching it, simply because I didn't expect it when I set out to research the chapter, was the one probably on Gibraltar. Gibraltar, as you probably know, is a peninsula that hangs off the bottom of Spain that's been British for through 300 years or so, ever since the Treaty of Utrecht. And, it was a British naval base. It's very famous in Britain, but it has reinvented itself in the last 2 or 3 decades as one of the major centres of offshore gambling. It has done this incredibly successfully, with huge profits for itself and enormous damage being done elsewhere, not least in the UK, where many of the gamblers live, but totally under the radar. Unremarked in Britain. The fact that one of our overseas territories is now this huge centre for the gambling business is totally unremarked, and that's amazing. And the impact that this little, Gibraltar is tiny. I ran around the place in an hour, and I'm not a fast runner. But the impact that this little patch of real estate has had on the rest of the world by becoming a haven for offshore gambling is absolutely extraordinary. So that story really shocked me. And to be honest, I've been a little bit disappointed that story in the book hasn't made more of an impact here in the UK. It has made a bit of an impact, but not as much as I would have hoped for, because I think it really demonstrates the kind of amoral nature of what I call butlering in Britain, this sort of serving the interests of anyone with wealth, despite the harm it causes elsewhere.
But now the UK is trying to tackle some of these problems, and the one especially related to real estate, by introducing a new register of overseas owners of UK properties. And I saw that you wrote an opinion piece on the topic. Can you explain what this register is and what you think of it? Will it really help?
Yeah, so, for a long time, oligarchs or whoever have been buying property in the UK didn't really want to have their ownership of that property publicly known. If you own property in the UK, then you're in the land registry and people can just look it up and find out who owns what. So they would own property via an offshore shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands or Liberia or Delaware or wherever. And that very effectively disguised their ownership of the property, and also very effectively minimized or entirely reduced the amount of tax they had to pay on that property. So the fact that oligarchs were hiding their ownership became a bit of a scandal. And so gradually politicians said they'd do something about this. First was proposed that there would be a new registry of the actual owners of these companies back in 2016. It finally came about as a result of the war in Ukraine. This legislation was rushed through, and the registry has been created and is now live. You can look it up and see who owns what. It hasn't yet got all the information it needs, but quite a lot of information is available, and it's interesting to have a look at. So that's good, and I should start my discussion of this by saying it's good. It's good that it's no longer possible to use an offshore shell company to hide your ownership of UK property. However, during this process, as I said, there were tax advantages using an offshore company. Successive governments eroded those tax advantages. So even before this registry came into effect, the owners of property looked for other ways to own property so as to maintain tax advantages. And they discovered a long time ago that it was far more tax efficient and, in fact, anonymous to own property via a trust than it is to own property via a shell company. So during the period when, there's been this heightened discussion of offshore companies, the number of offshore companies that own property in the UK has been pretty flat, about 90 to 95,000. So that's in England and Wales. But, there probably are, I don't know how many more there are in Scotland, but it wouldn't be that many more. But in England and Wales, to 90 to 95,000. During that same period, so over the last decade, the number of offshore registered individuals, so trustees who own property, has increased by about 250%. So it's clear that wealthy foreigners buying property have just gone into using trusts. And this transparency legislation has made no difference on that at all. So, the door of the stable is shut, but the horse is over the horizon and long and far away. And if we wish to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to need to really tackle trusts as well.
So over to banks and AML. So banks, they have been, they are under heavy regulation and are supposed to uncover and stop financial crime. Do you think the current AML legislation in Europe is addressing this issue properly?
No, I don't think it is. Not because banks aren't doing a good job. I think banks are spending a huge amount of money to comply with AML regulations. I just think the AML regulations are absolutely terrible.
What in particular do you think is terrible and should be changed?
Actually, what's going to be my next book is going to be about this.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm having fun investigating and looking into AML at the moment. It's a really interesting story. I think that the problem is that money launderers are entrepreneurial and flexible and endlessly inventive. And so as soon as restrictions are put in their way, they will just find new ways of laundering money. And restrictions on the financial system are now so onerous that, if you are a clever money launderer with large amounts of money to launder, you'd be foolish, really, to move it via, a major financial institution in the same way that people used to in the old days. So it seems to me very obvious that most money laundering, most very large-scale money laundering is now done via the trade system, via the movement of goods rather than the movement of, financial deposits. That seems, just looking at the numbers in discrepancies in trade figures, that seems obvious to me. The fact that, trade-based money laundering receives almost no attention from policymakers and very minimal attention from the Financial Action Task Force strikes me as a real dereliction of duty.
Why do you think that is? Is it because people don't know about it, or is it just because of the inherent slowness of regulations?
Look, it's like that old joke about the drunkard who loses his keys, right? And he's looking for them under the streetlight. And the policeman says, "What are you looking for?" He says, "We're looking for my keys." And the policeman says, "Did you drop them here?" And he says, "No, I dropped them in the park, but it's too dark to look for them there, so I'm looking for them here." It feels a bit like that with money laundering, that, it's really, relatively easy to look for discrepancies in financial transactions, because financial transactions, it's fungible. You're talking about, a limited number of currencies. $1 is the same as another dollar. 1 kroner is the same as another kroner, and that all exists in a spreadsheet, and that's that. Trade isn't like that. A car isn't like another car. A barrel of Urals crude is different to a barrel of Brent crude. It's much harder to compare trade figures, and it would be a real labor to try and look for discrepancies in trade figures in a systematic way, and would require a huge amount of invention and manpower. And frankly, I think no one can be bothered. So I think that we have a Potemkin system that looks like it's fighting money laundering, and it's staffed by lots of well-meaning people who I speak to find it extremely frustrating that they're working their socks off and not really achieving anything. And I think the reason is that we're built. It's like a castle when you've got one extremely well fortified piece of the wall, but if you want to enter the castle, you can just walk around and there's no wall around the rest of it. So why would anyone, if you wanted to launder huge amounts of money out of China, for example, move it via the formal financial system, when you can just misinvoice a load of, I don't know, iPhones and be done with it? It seems pretty obvious to me. So I don't think that the current financial regulations around money laundering are working. It's very hard to tell how we'd know if they were working, because there isn't really any serious systematic work being done to estimate the amount of money laundering there is in the world. But it's certainly remarkable that sort of notorious estimate of the size of the illicit economy made back in the late 90s, 2 to 5% of global GDP. And I appreciate that was just a guess at the time, but people still use that estimate. And you still hear people saying it's 2 to 5% of global GDP. Think how much effort we've been making to tackle money laundering and terrorist financing in the last, 2.5 decades. And yet the estimate of the size of the global criminal economy is exactly the same as a proportion of the formal economy as it was back then. That is not a system that's working.
That is a good point. There isn't. What do you think it is? How would you go about estimating it? Or like...
Well, now you're asking me to talk about how I'd go about estimating it. I find I'm very interested in the volume of cash money that there is in circulation in the world. By cash money, I mean banknotes. It is a remarkable paradox that at the same time that in probably every single country that isn't at war at the moment, the cash usage as a proportion of transactions monitored by central banks is falling. In many Western countries, it's now really in very low double digits as a proportion of transactions, and yet the amount of cash in circulation increases year after year after year. There's now 2.3 trillion US dollars outstanding out there somewhere, twice as many as there were a decade ago. And yet cash usage in the United States is falling. The same is true in the Eurozone. What's 1.6 trillion euros outstanding, and yet cash usage is falling. Same is true in the UK, Canada, Australia, almost everywhere apart from Sweden. Sweden seems to have the right idea here. So I was just going to say, why is all that cash? Why is it out there? Who's actually using it? It seems fairly clear to me that this is at least in large part explained by the size of the criminal economy. So if I were going about estimating the size of the criminal economy, I'd start there.
If you were a head of AML in a bank and hearing what you said now, what kind of measures or risk policies would you implement the next day if you just learned about this trade-based money laundering?
If I was head of AML, I'd do exactly the same as they're all doing, because they're not stupid and they know what they're doing. The risk that they face, being blunt, this is part of the problem with the global AML system. The risk that compliance officers face is not money laundering, it's being prosecuted by the DOJ, right? That's the problem.
They're failing to be non-compliant, not really stopping money laundering.
It's nothing to do with stopping money laundering. It's all about not facing a 9-figure fine from the DOJ. That's the incentive. And if your incentive is avoiding being fined by the DOJ, you do everything to be compliant with the regulations as they stand. The problem is at a higher level. It's not with heads of compliance who are just doing what's expected of them. It's at governments who don't appear to appreciate the scale of the problem, don't appreciate what's really happening, and don't use the Financial Action Task Force as a forum to really coordinate efforts that would genuinely make a difference. Because as it stands, they more or less use it to bully small countries into doing things that big countries have no intention of doing themselves. And while money laundering continues, as far as I can tell, almost uninterrupted. So no, I'm not a big fan of the global AML system, but I don't blame compliance professionals for that. That's not their fault. They're doing what's expected of them and demanded of them. I'm not saying they all do, but in the main, most ones I meet seem to be pretty decent people.
Yeah, same. I have the same impression. People just want to, or I have the impression that people really want to do good, but they're also stuck like with an endless task list of like shoveling data around in old systems, or there's such a huge workforce now in compliance, and it just grows year over year over year. But a lot of people aren't really then spending the time doing investigations and uncovering true risk and money laundering, but more just fulfilling compliance regulations in like with bad technology.
Yeah, and you're just kicking the risk onto someone else, right? If you do all your work and you get your red flags and you file your suspicious activity reports to the Financial Intelligence Unit, and then the risk is dumped onto them, and then what do they do with the suspicious activity reports? Well, they may get around to reading them or they may not, but they then, if they do, they'll kick it onto a law enforcement agency, and then they may do something with it or they may not. But most of the time, nothing really happens. Yeah, and so everyone's generating all these alerts, and it never really leads to anything. So, yes, like you say, a lot of it's about antiquated computer systems, but to my mind, a lot of it's about there just not being sufficient staffing in law enforcement agencies and regulatory bodies, and that's a question of a lack of political priority at the top. The governments in almost all countries are failing to take financial crime seriously. They're not taking kleptocracy seriously. And sadly, the fruit of that is what's happening in Ukraine right now. That's what happens if you don't take kleptocracy seriously. Someone like Putin is able to build a regime like he built in Russia, a really aggressive kleptocracy. And, and we're all paying the price. It would be far better to learn the lesson from this, that we shouldn't let that happen again. We should prevent that money coming into our countries in the first place, should prevent oligarchs being able to build up these kind of large fortunes. And if we do that, in the long run, we might cost our lawyers some fees and we might cost our estate agents some sales, but in the long run, we would make the whole world more prosperous and safer.
But one specific question is back to the AML legislation. What is your take on the recent ruling from the EU Court Justice on the public access to UBO registers?
I think it's a complete disaster. One of the most disappointing developments in, AML policy or top-level policy in recent years. We've had this. The direction of travel has been quite positive in terms of transparency in the EU, in the UK, in the US with the their own corporate transparency agenda, which admittedly is a bit partial, but still, it's from a pretty bad place. They're getting to a better place. In the UK's network of tax havens, all of this, is this. The fact that everyone's moving together means that everyone is emboldened to keep moving. It's not one country going off on its own; it's everyone acting together. The fact that the European Court has, in this, I think, extraordinarily perverse judgment, decided that rich people have a right to privacy when incorporating companies, that will inevitably impact on the willingness of Britain's network of tax havens to go along with requests from London, because they say, well, we'll just be outcompeted by Luxembourg. It will inevitably have impact on legal appeals in the United States, where people's clients will also feel that they don't want to reveal their ownership of companies. And so there'll be challenges in the United States in the same way. So no, I think it's a great shame. And, I would really hope that some European politicians are trying to find a way of around it, but I haven't really seen any sign of that. It's funny.
I think it's still, we'll wait and see. Hopefully some like AML6 directive and people will be able to do something around that to circumvent this.
Yeah, but I mean, so I'm sitting in the UK and, I don't know if you've noticed, but Brexit hasn't been going very well. We've been keeping that quiet, but it's been a bit of a disaster. But if you're looking at weird advantages of Brexit, the fact that we're not in the EU means that we don't have to apply to this ECJ ruling. We can maintain.
Yeah, that is true.
Our transparent, our transparent register. I mean, we were talking about the register of offshore ownership of property. Who knows, if we were still in the EU, would that be ruled illegal as a violation of the privacy of oligarchs? They're not allowed to use offshore companies to own property in the UK anymore. It's utterly perverse ruling. I really don't understand it. If you don't want, to have your identity known, just don't own property via a company. Just own it in your own name. It's all, or just rent it. There are lots of ways around not having to declare your identity. So it's a real shame.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, you are of course shedding a lot of light on the topic with your writing and the books. But what do you think other players in the compliance industry, such as Strise, and who do develop software for within the compliance space, what could we do to put a more emphasis on this? The EU Court Justice ruling is one thing, but the wider topic in general.
I mean, look, I think people are doing good work. I mean, I find it really interesting. I've talked to people who do sort of, I lose, reg tech, however you pronounce it. In terms of that kind of stuff, people are doing interesting, blockchain tracing stuff for crypto, and there's all kinds of fun stuff happening all the time. I lose track of all the fun stuff that's happening, but the problem is that it's just more efficient ways of looking for the keys under the streetlight. The keys aren't under the streetlight, so it doesn't really matter how efficient you make the AML compliance system if you're looking in the wrong place. So I think that there has to be a greater awareness of money laundering in the round. The fact that trade-based money laundering gets almost no attention. It's very, very rarely discussed. It's very poorly understood. Trying to explain it to policymakers is a real challenge. If I do a talk and I talk about it, people come up afterwards and say, "God, that's amazing! I didn't know that." And I'm like, "How you're in the financial crime space? How did you not know about this?" So I think that there is a real dereliction of duty at the very top in terms of trying to set the agenda around what money laundering is and what it is we're trying to stop. Because, what's this for? Why are we expending this colossal effort? How much is the global compliance industry worth? I know, tens of billions of dollars, right? Hundreds, maybe.
Yeah, it's crazy.
The incredibly expensive business, which is totally failing to stop money laundering, like totally failing. So, why are we demanding that private companies spend this huge amount of money to achieve nothing? That is a question that private companies should be asking politicians. Why are you demanding we spend all this money when it's not changing the situation at all? You are costing us all this money, and yet you are not doing the basic work that you should be doing to make sure that all this money is spent effectively. Because, I've heard, Jason Sharman, whose work I'm sure who's a professor at Cambridge University and done some really important work investigating money laundering and structures around money laundering. I've heard him say, slightly playing devil's advocate at conferences, but arguing quite, convincingly that we should just give up on AML altogether. It's not achieving anything and it's really expensive, so why bother? And I don't, obviously, and he doesn't agree with that. He's making a joke, and I don't agree with it at all. But if you are going to demand that, private sector companies spend a huge amount of money in order to meet some form of public policy objective, then it is incumbent on you as a politician to make sure that that policy that you're setting out is a coherent one. And at the moment, it isn't. So that's what I think is wrong with the entire ML system. That it isn't actually trying to stop money laundering. It's just trying to comply with an almost entirely random selection of requirements set quite a long time ago by people who didn't really understand what they were doing.
I think we need to do a part 2 of this episode when we go into the details of like trade-based money laundering and all of this, because it's super interesting. I had no idea this conversation would take this turn. I had all these questions about oligarchs and property in the UK, and this is super interesting.
Getting me to stop talking is the challenge. Seriously.
Where do we go from here? How do let's get back to the Britain, the butler to the world. How do we clean up the mess we've put ourselves into?
Look, in the UK, we got transparent offshore ownership of property. It is good. It's not everything, but it's good. We've got a new economic crime bill going through Parliament at the moment, hopefully giving our corporate registry, Companies House, the powers to check the ownership of shell companies, UK registered ones. That's also good. These are two important pieces of legislation giving important powers to regulators and registries. They need to be used. it's no point just buying gym membership if you don't go to the gym, right? It's at the moment, we've got the gym membership, we've got the leisure wear to go to the gym in, but so now you need to do the workouts and get fit. So, the government needs to give corporate registry, Companies House, the money and the people it needs to do the job that's being asked of it. It needs to give the law enforcement agencies, National Crime Agency, the Metropolitan Police, City of London Police, and so on, Serious Fraud Office, the money and the people they need to investigate oligarchs, to drive this money out of London and to confiscate what's already here. And then, if that happens, you can look around and see if any more laws are needed. But we've got good laws. The laws aren't the problem. The problem is enforcement. So what I would like to see is, the kind of resourcing for fighting financial crime that there is for fighting tax fraud. There are thousands of investigators who do a good job of investigating tax fraud in the UK. They keep the tax gap really quite low by international standards. There should be that kind of focus on tackling financial crime. And, I really feel that, there is an opportunity to create a new kind of financial centre in London, which is clean. That this is the place you go if you want clean finance. That, this is where you go and you're not going to get defrauded, and you're not going to have this excessive bureaucracy, that that the people you're going to be dealing with are well regulated. And, if anyone breaks the law, they get prosecuted. That's what I'd like to see. But, it's not going to be easy. But I do think that there's a real prize at the end of that, particular road, which is available if any politician has the vision to implement it.
I think that was a hopeful ending to the episode. Thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure having you here. I learned tons, and I'm hoping you want to do another episode. So yeah, hope to see you back.
Yeah, maybe when I'm next in Norway, we can do it live.
Yeah, money make a world.